the study. Would you like to leave your cares behind for a while and accompany me on a journey through the wondrous decade of the 1680s? I thought you might. From the comfort of the study, we will see shifting alliances, great battles, groundbreaking discoveries, seminal works of science, diplomacy, sweet culinary traditions, and sublime poetry, with the soft sounds of books, paper, and a view below to accompany us to the realm of relaxation. The end of the 17th century was the beginning of the modern world. The Great Plague was drawing to an end. London was being rebuilt after the Great Fire of 1666, thanks to the architectural design of Christopher Wren. There was a surge in industry, science, learning, population growth, employment, empires, commerce and trade, but there were also religious wars resulting from Reformation that were drawing to an end. The end of the Civil War in England all marked the beginning of the Age of Reason, or the Enlightenment. Many pivotal points in history occurred during this decade: cultural, constitutional, social revolutions, and the establishment of European alliances that would encompass the globe and set the stage for the next 2 centuries. As with many periods of great advancement, the backdrop was war. The 9 Years' War, or the War of the Grand Alliance, the League of Augsburg, was the beginning of what would be a lasting large-scale wars between the imperial powers of Europe that reached to their colonial holdings around the world. It centered around the conflict between France and a coalition comprising the Holy Roman Empire of the Habsburg dynasty, the Dutch Republic, England, Spain, Savoy, and Portugal. The First Global War also encompassed conflict in Ireland, Jacobite risings in Scotland, where William III and James II vied for power, North America, where French and English colonists and their indigenous allies fought for control of the rich continent, as well as holdings in Africa and India. After the Franco-Dutch War of 1678, Louis XIV of France had emerged as the most powerful monarch in Europe. France, however, was surrounded by its rivals, namely the Habsburg Empire, controlling and comprising the Spanish Netherlands, the Rhineland, the Duchy of Savoy, and Catalonia in Spain. This war left Europe financially exhausted and keen to negotiate terms. The Treaty of Ryswick redrew France's borders once again along the banks of the Rhine, as well as stipulating that Louis XIV recognized the Dutch William III as rightful King of England. Charles II of Spain would die without issue, and a new dispute over the inheritance of the Austrian allied Spanish Empire would embroil Louis XIV and the Grand Alliance in the War of the Spanish Succession in the coming century. On the Eastern Front, Europe was embroiled in conflict with the Ottoman Empire. The Sixth Ottoman-Venetian War, fought between the Republic of Venice and the Ottoman Empire, part of the Great Turkish War, brought the conquerors of the Turkish homeland to the gates of Vienna, the capital of the Habsburg Empire. Fighting spread from Dalmatia to the Aegean Sea as Venice fought to avenge the loss of Crete. But the Ottomans were entangled in the struggle against the Habsburgs in the north, beginning with the failed Ottoman attempt to conquer Vienna and ending with the Habsburgs gaining the whole of Hungary. So relax with me now as we take a look at just some of the elements and events that marked Europe's entry into the modern world. (1683) The Battle of Vienna. The Ottoman siege of the imperial city of Vienna began on the 14th of July, 1683, and Kara Mustafa sent a demand that the city surrender to the Ottoman Empire. Vienna had already received news of the mass slaughter at a town to the south, where the citizens had handed over the keys of the city, only to be killed anyway. Graf von Starhemberg, commander of the remaining 15,000 troops and 8,700 volunteers, refused to capitulate. The Viennese had created an empty plain around the city's perimeter walls that would expose the Ottomans to defensive fire if they tried to rush the city. So they dug in. Kara Mustafa ordered his forces to dig lines of trenches towards the city, and miners to set explosive powder under the city's defensive walls. In retaliation, the Viennese set huge tree trunks into the ground surrounding their walls in order to disrupt this strategy. Meanwhile, however, the siege had cut virtually every means of food supply into Vienna. The increasingly desperate forces holding Vienna were soon on their last legs. By the 6th of September, the Poles, under Jan Sobieski, crossed the Danube 30 kilometers to the northwest of Vienna to unite with imperial troops and additional forces from Saxony, Bavaria, Baden, Franconia, and Swabia. They were joined by mercenary regiments of Cossacks hired by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The leadership of these allied forces was entrusted to the Polish king, who had under his command 80,000 soldiers facing an Ottoman army of 150,000. Jan Sobieski's courage and remarkable aptitude for command was well known in Europe, and the pluck of his winged hussars, heavily armored shock cavalry, was renowned, and thus they made September, approximately 5,000 experienced Ottoman sappers repeatedly blew up large portions of Vienna's defensive walls with gunpowder. The Viennese tried to counter this by digging tunnels to intercept them. On the 8th of September, the Ottomans finally managed to occupy the lower wall. Anticipating a breach in the city walls, the Viennese prepared to fight in the inner city. At 4 a.m. on the 12th of September, the Ottomans attacked. Charles of Lorraine moved forward with the imperial army on the left and further imperial forces in the center. Heavy fighting ensued, and they withstood multiple Ottoman counterattacks, taking several key positions. By noon, the imperial army was close to breaking through the Ottoman lines. Mustafa Pasha launched counterattacks with most of his force, intending to take Vienna before Sobieski arrived. But time ran out. Their sappers had prepared a large final detonation. 10 mines were set to explode, but they were found just in time by the Viennese. In the early afternoon, the Polish infantry advanced on the Ottoman right flank outside the city. Instead of turning to face the relief army, the Ottomans continued their efforts to force their way into the city. The Poles made good progress, and by 4 p.m. they had taken a village that would serve as a base for a massive cavalry charge. By 5 p.m. the imperial forces resumed the offensive and were close to the central Ottoman position. As they were preparing to storm it, they could see the Polish cavalry over the hills around Vienna, advancing. The winged hussars slowly emerged from the forest to the cheers of the onlooking infantry and began obliterating the Ottoman lines approaching the center. The Ottoman vizier then left his position and retreated to his headquarters in the main camp, farther to the south. At around 6 p.m., Jan Sobieski, the Polish king, ordered the cavalry attack in 4 groups, 3 Polish and 1 from the Holy Roman Empire. 18,000 horsemen charged down the hills surrounding Vienna, the largest cavalry charge in history. Jan Sobieski led the initial charge at the head of 3,000 heavy lancers, the famed winged hussars. It was the stuff of legend. The charge easily broke the Ottoman lines and made straight for the Ottoman camps and Kara Mustafa's headquarters, while the remaining Viennese garrison sallied out to join the assault. Less than 3 hours after the cavalry attack, the Catholic forces had won the battle and saved Vienna. So great and momentous was this victory over the threat of Ottoman expansion into the continent of Europe that it had lasting cultural impacts. After the Battle of Vienna, the newly identified constellation Scutum, or Latin for shield, was named Scutum Sobieskianum by the astronomer Johannes Hevelius in honor of King John III Sobieski of Poland, who had led the cavalry charge. While there are some stars named after known astronomers, this is the only constellation that was originally named after a known astronomer who was still alive when it was named. Music, of course, was influenced. It is said that the victors found a double reed instrument in the Ottomans' abandoned luggage, the tarogato, that would become the Hungarian national instrument. The composer Johann Joseph Fuchs composed his Symphonia Koshor 331 in 7 parts, named Turkaria, after the Turkish siege. The score is for viols and continua, but has since been performed with more instruments, including the use of Turkish cymbals and reed instruments, which it most certainly was at the time, performed in the Turkish style, with the exotic instruments of the East in participation. There are some very good performances here on YouTube. Another legend is that the croissant was invented in Vienna to celebrate the victory, with a shape symbolizing the crescents on the Ottoman flag. Croissants in France were a pastry called Viennoiserie. Today there is a biscuit known as the Viennese Kipferl, now brought out mostly at Christmas, that lends itself to the legend of sweets inspired by the Ottoman Empire's cuisine, the shape of the crescent, and the use of exotic nuts and spices. Coffee, too, made a prominent appearance in Vienna around this time, and it was the start of what would become a grand coffeehouse culture. There's an often recited story that, after the battle, the residents of Vienna discovered bags of coffee in the abandoned Ottoman encampment. Like the disputing cafes in England, namely Oxford, claiming to be the first to serve coffee, Vienna's first coffee house is elusive. Some say the first coffee house in Vienna was established by the Armenian Johannes Deodat in 1685. Deodato had been a spy and had served with the Viennese imperial court. He knew about the dark beans and the art of preparing coffee from his home country in Armenia. The Johannes Deodato Park in Wieden, in the 4th district of Vienna, is dedicated to him. Others say that using the captured stock of beans, Franciszek Jerzy Grzycki opened the first coffee house, serving coffee with milk, and was the first to obtain a license to serve coffee in the city following his heroic actions during the siege, and a street in the 4th district was named after him, a statue put up at the corner of the Favoritenstraße or Kolschitsky-Gasse. Yet another story is that the captured stock of bitter coffee was mixed with sugar and steamed milk to produce a drink that was named cappuccino, in honor of the Capuchin Franciscan Marco d'Aviano, who had inspired the Catholic forces to unity and to the defense of Vienna. Whatever the origin, the Turkish influence certainly left its mark in many ways after this siege of 1683. Let's break for some Viennese treats. So let's have a look at our Viennese coffee. So it's a very strong blend, as you know, with the burned beans. And you can see I've put it in a glass so that you can see. We're going to put some very heavy, thick cream on top, and this is supposed to sit on the top of the coffee as it's drunk. It's a very creamy coffee, and it's usually topped with either cinnamon or some chocolate. So I've got some dark chocolate here, and I'm going to top it with some dark chocolate shavings. There we go. And there we have a nice and creamy Viennese coffee. Now I didn't whip the cream, but if you want the cream to absolutely sit on top, then you can whip the cream a little bit. And to accompany it, there are our crescent-shaped biscuits, the vanilla Kipferl, a very sweety Viennese treat shaped in the form of a crescent moon. Now I've made these with walnuts and almonds, and I added a little cinnamon and nutmeg because I wanted to make sure I had some of the spices from the silk roots that Turkey would have brought to the continent. And this recipe is very similar to that of many of the countries that had connections to this trade route. And there you can see the inside has ground walnuts and almonds in it, or chopped, and very sweet with vanilla sugar, lots of confectioners or powdered sugar, and lovely with this strong Viennese coffee. So a lot of the countries that would have had these Kipferl around the Mediterranean and near the trade routes have very similar recipes. Russian tea cakes, Italian wedding biscuits. The Venetians also have some. And this recipe, or variations of it, have even made their way into Mexico and South America. In Mexico, they are called Mexican wedding cookies, and they use the local ingredient of pecans. So they're a very sweet, fluffy biscuit that lends itself to the exotic nuts and spices that are found in the colonies and along the spice routes where these biscuits find themselves. So there we have our creamy Viennese coffee afternoon. In 1686, Lloyd's Coffee House was opened by Edward Lloyd on Tower Street in London. Popular with sailors, merchants, and ship owners, Lloyd catered to them by providing reliable shipping news, and people came there to discuss maritime insurance, shipbroking, and foreign trade, leading to the establishment of Lloyd's of London Insurance Brokers, Lloyd's Register, and related shipping and insurance businesses. Despite its humble founding, Lloyd's still exists today as Lloyd's of London, one of the oldest insurance markets. It was the coffeehouse culture throughout Europe that provided a place to meet and exchange ideas not only for businessmen and merchants, but for poets, playwrights, politicians, authors, and statesmen. Their opinions, ideas, music, and literature were published profusely, with phenomenal expansion of the presses and dissemination of printed material. Here we see a chart of the output of printed books in Europe between 1450 and 1800, and you can see that the number of books being published and put out to the public more than doubled from the 16th to the 17th century, and doubled again in the 18th century, showing how much printed material had come into the mainstream, and indicating how influential ideas on printed matter could be. Eating establishments also were the meeting places for all kinds of groups of industrious intellectuals. One of these places was the Trumpet Tavern in London, near Temple Bar, where Christopher Cat, known as Kit, served his famous mutton pies, and where a group of literary illuminati, the poet laureate John Dryden, their apotheosis, formed the famous Kit Kat Club. The Enlightenment philosopher John Locke wrote in 1690 that, alongside divine law and civil law, the third type of law was the law of opinion, praise or blame, which, by a secret and tacit consent, establishes itself in the several societies, tribes, and clubs of men in the world. The Kit Kat Club continued the 17th century tradition of clubs of men, carving out negative freedoms from the state, not least of which was the right to hold meetings and discuss their opinions freely. Kit Kat members would help shape the nation's taste, character, and international image in the coming decades, planting a particular idea of Englishness in the popular imagination and contributing to the building of a more prosperous, polite, and self-confident society. John Dryden, poet, literary critic, translator, musical composer, and playwright, dominated the literary life of Restoration England. He established the heroic couplet as a standard form of English poetry, with which he wrote his satires, religious pieces, epigrams, fables, prologues, and plays, and was more often than not making political statements. His influence stretched through to the 20th century, and his admirers were many. One of Dryden's poems that I would like to read a part of to you is Alexander's Feast, or the Power of Music, describing a feast celebrating the victory of Alexander the Great over Darius of Persia. In the Persian capital of Persepolis, a feast is laid, and Alexander's bard, Timotheus, sings his praises, moving Alexander emotionally to inebriation, love, anger, and vengeance, and then embarking on a description of Saint Cecilia, patron saint of music. It was said that Timotheus raised a mortal to the skies sate upon his imperial throne. His valiant peers were placed around, their brows with roses and with myrtles bound, so should desert in arms be crowned. The lovely Dice by his side sate like a blooming eastern bride, in flower of youth and beauty's pride. Happy, happy, happy pair, none but the brave deserves the fair. Timotheus placed on high, amid the tuneful choir, with flying fingers touched the sky and heavenly joys inspire. The song began from Jove, who left his blissful seats above. Such is the power of mighty love. A dragon's fiery form belied the god, sublime on radiant spires he rode, when he to fair Olympia pressed, and while he sought her snowy breast, then round her slender waist he curled, and stamped an image of himself, a sovereign of the world. The listening crowd admired the lofty sound. A present deity, they shout around, a present deity, the vaulted roofs rebound. With ravished ears the monarch hears, assumes the god, affects to nod, and seems to shake the spheres. Less sociable was the intellectual Isaac Newton. It was in 1687 that he published his seminal work, Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy. It expanded on Newton's laws of motion and the law of universal gravitation. It was published in 3 books in Latin in July 1687. No work was more pivotal in the development of modern physics and astronomy than Newton's Principia. It concluded for the first time that the force retaining the planets in their orbits is the same as terrestrial gravity. The success of Newton's theory of gravity rendered the identification of the fundamental forces of nature and their characterization in laws the primary pursuit of physics. It also led to a new concept of exact science and the relation between observation and theory, the scientific method which has shaped science ever since. The turbulent stage of European politics and military conflicts that was the backdrop for these commercial and intellectual groundbreakers was no less present in England. The Declaration of Indulgence was proclaimed by James II of England and 7th of Scotland in 1687, establishing the beginning of freedom of religion in Britain. Religious penal laws were suspended, and James granted tolerance to the various Christian denominations within his kingdoms. But this was opposed by Anglicans, both on religious and constitutional grounds. The Glorious Revolution ensued, in which James was deposed and replaced by his Protestant daughter, Mary II, and her husband, William III of Orange, ruler of the Dutch Republic. One of the events leading to this deposition was the birth of a prince, about placing Mary as heir presumptive and creating the prospect of a Catholic monarchy. Eventually, a coalition of English politicians invited William to cross the Channel from Holland and secure the English throne for Mary. Louis XIV of France was already preparing to attack the Dutch, so William saw an opportunity to secure English resources for the war against France. On the 5th of November, he landed with 14,000 men and was joined by the 30,000-strong Royal Army as he marched to London. James went into exile, and in April 1689, Parliament declared William and Mary joint monarchs of England and Ireland. It is said that this revolution ended a century of political dispute by confirming the primacy of Parliament over the Crown, established in the Bill of Rights of 1689. Thank you, my friend, for accompanying me through the decade of the 1680s. I hope you found it relaxing and informative. Be good to yourself, be kind to others,